Thank you all very much. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today. As Dora suggested, the topic I'm going to talk about is maybe in some respects unusual, but I would suggest greed is a concept that is not altogether alien to business schools, and maybe to Booth in particular. I think the way in which we often think about greed is it's a bit like that hobgoblin who's under the table or perhaps in the closet, at the very kind of edge of our sight and always there with us. And what makes perhaps this discussion a little bit unusual is I'm going to bring greed right out into the daylight, and we're going to talk about it nakedly. And hopefully that kind of a discussion will be interesting for you in your own professional experience. And to the degree it's not interesting, luckily we do have more drinks after the talk is concluded. And so for the next roughly 50 minutes, I'm going to attempt to give you a short history of greed, or the best that I can possibly do under the circumstances. This discussion takes shape around an article that I've written for the fall 2017 issue of the Chicago Booth Review. It is a retrospective look at the 30th anniversary of the movie Wall Street, which is most famous for us today for the character of Gordon Gekko and his famous monologue, "Greed is Good." We're going to talk about Gordon Gekko toward the very end of this presentation. Gekko will be somewhat of the end point of our discussion. But for now, I think it's important to keep in mind, one, that we are looking into the past to try to understand the present and look very much toward the future. So I don't want to talk about Gekko too much. We'll get to him at the end of the talk. But I do want to bring about one figure before we jump to the distant past, someone who predates Gekko by only a year, in this case, Ivan Boesky. So Ivan Boesky is the famous arbitrageur and hostile takeover specialist. And in 1986, as Oliver Stone was putting together the movie Wall Street, he gave the now perhaps infamous speech to the University of California, Berkeley's graduates at the 1986 graduation. Now, as part of that speech, he gave the following statement to the students. "Greed is all right, by the way. I want you to know that. I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself." That statement, which I think to us probably strikes us as not a kind of resounding endorsement of greed, at the time was pretty remarkable. A lot of news agencies covered it, and as Oliver Stone was putting together the movie Wall Street, he took note and ended up writing the monologue that becomes "Greed is Good." What's striking to me now, looking at this quote and looking back at the way in which we think about greed, is the ambivalence that is inflected in that quote. Boesky doesn't say entirely greed is absolutely good, but he wants to suggest that the moral status of greed is something that can, in some respects, be redeeming. That ambivalence is still there, but if we're going to go back to a time when it's not ambivalent, we're going to look at a time beyond capitalism. So we jump into a time machine which takes us back hundreds of years to a time when the status of greed, morally speaking, was not at all ambivalent. Greed was understood to be a force that was entirely dangerous. I like this particular quote from Shakespeare because I think it actually represents what was at stake if you took greed very seriously. For those of you who remember the play Othello, in the very early part of the play, the villainous figure Iago is trying to comfort another character, Roderigo. Roderigo has an unyielding crush on Desdemona, Othello's wife at this point in the play. And he is so heartsick, he threatens to commit suicide. And Iago, the villainous figure that he is, comforts him by saying, "If thou wilt needs damn thyself, do it a more delicate way than drowning. Make all the money thou canst." Now, what I think is to me striking about that statement, which is kind of said with a bit of a leer, is the notion that devoting yourself to money-making is the type of activity with the highest stakes imaginable, your eternal soul. By committing yourself to money-making, you put yourself on the road to damnation in the same way, at this point in time, if you took your own life. The stakes certainly don't get any higher than that. Well, what was ultimately the problem with greed? What were people so concerned about? Let me give you a couple of examples. On the one hand, there was this belief that the kind of greedy instinct was somewhat of a disorder within the human soul, a disease of sort, a compulsion. What do I mean by that? To the degree that greed, of course, interacts with material goods and our pursuit therein, people who are greedy by nature seem to have a kind of overweening concern for material goods. And you take an example from someone in the Middle Ages like St. Thomas Aquinas, when he was talking about this commitment to money-making and the disorder that was in it. Aquinas said, money-making that serves only the desire for gain or profit, which knows no limit but tends to infinity. This is a way of kind of influencing the personal self and our desires, which again, if you are in St. Thomas Aquinas' time, or really for any person before the 19th century, this type of a commitment was seen as a disorder in the individual soul, a kind of disease, a compulsion that was dangerous. But it was not just dangerous to the single individual. Greed was not just a disorder that could influence you individually, it could also have an effect on the broader community. Here I have a quote from Martin Luther, which I think captures this in a really remarkable way, that greed could be this kind of social dysfunction that would end up undermining the community. In this case, the kind of compulsion that he's describing is that which is connected to, say, the merchant, someone who has devoted his life to money-making. Luther says, merchants have a common rule among them. It is their motto, and bottom of all their practices, I shall sell my ware as dear as I can, or as expensively as I can. This they hold to be their right, but it means making room for greed and opening the door and window for hell. Now again, this maybe sounds like a bit extreme to us, and let's be clear, people like Martin Luther and St. Thomas Aquinas were talking in extreme terms, because again, the stakes could not be higher. I think in a kind of broader sense, though, the dangers of greed, socially speaking, and that's going to be something that will be important for us as we look through this talk, is well captured by Dante. So here we have a particular etching from Gustave Doré, an illustration from his 19th century edition of Dante Alighieri's The Inferno. When Dante, along with his guide Virgil, get to the fourth circle of hell, they begin interacting with a group of people who are too dedicated to worldly goods. On the one hand, you have the hoarders or the misers, and on the other hand, you have the spendthrifts. When Dante comes upon these people, what he finds is that because of their sins, for an eternity, they're sentenced to push boulders around, smashing into each other. Now, in Doré's specific illustration, you actually see them pushing around money bags. And at this particular moment, Dante says, here too I saw a nation of lost souls, far more than were above. They strained their chests against enormous weights, and with mad howls rolled them at one another. Then in haste they rolled them back, one party shouting, why do you hoard? And the other, why do you waste? What I think is important to kind of bear in mind here is the notion not only that a kind of commitment to greed or money-making could end up disordering your own individual self, but that it would also influence human interaction, and it would not be productive of the kind of human community that we would ultimately want to live in. Instead, it would look very much like Dante's Inferno, individuals constantly competing and smashing into one another. So obviously, the moral status of greed, as opposed to, say, Ivan Boesky, is not at all ambivalent at this time. If you have an overweening commitment to worldly goods, to their pursuit, this is a dangerous place to be, and not the type of thing that anyone wants to be engaged in. And one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is how difficult this made doing business for most anybody. How do you actually think about being engaged in business if you can never talk about your own interests, your own needs, your own desires? It doesn't seem to be very easy. And frankly, the status of the merchant or the person who commits himself to making money at this point in time is again not ambivalent at all, but is always cast in the shadow of suspicion. Well, what changes? The introduction of this individual, Bernard Mandeville. Bernard Mandeville is a figure who is largely forgotten today, which I think is unfortunate. He was a Dutch physician who came to England to learn the language and decided to stay on to search after his fortune. He became kind of a famous figure. Today I would liken him to, say, a Christopher Hitchens, a person who had a kind of wry and often dark sense of humor. He was a splendid writer and held forth on a lot of different topics. He was always kind of a figure in the public eye. His most famous work, and the one that he is remembered for today, however, is called The Fable of the Bees, and it's exactly what it sounds. It's an allegorical poem that focuses on a beehive that actually happens to look a lot like any major city at the time, whether that's a London or a Paris. The beehive is a center of thriving industry where the bees are affluent and successful, everyone is engaged in trade. It's a kind of portrait of what any modern society would hope to become. But instead of being fueled by virtue, the society is fueled by vice. Every single individual is engaged in some kind of trade or practice that sees them putting to use vanity or greed or the grossest form of ambition or pride in order to kind of fuel the work that they do. Now, if you were providing a kind of portrait of the Middle Ages and you described a society that was filled with vice, the vision that you would have would be one of a kind of Mad Max hellscape of chaos. But this beehive did not end up looking like it. Instead, it was actually a portrait of tremendous affluence. All the bees, though engaged in their vice, were all tremendously productive, and everyone seemed to benefit. Now, this did not end up keeping the bees from being hypocrites and complaining about the very vice they benefited from. All the bees went around talking about, oh, the dangers of greed and the dangers of vanity and the dangers of ambition, and yet they all gladly enjoyed the material benefits that came from those passions. And finally, who gets fed up with them? Well, no one less than God himself. He snaps his fingers, and the bees all become virtuous. Well, what happens then? Society essentially collapses and shrinks. On the one hand, take, for example, the taverns. With no one going to drink their face off after a long day of work, they shut up shop. Think of the fashion houses. With no one deciding to get the new fall clothes and the new spring clothes, they no longer can sell their wares, they set up shop. Think of the lawyers and the judges. With no one breaking laws anymore, their services are not needed, they set up shop. Society begins to shrink. And why? Because those who are least well off under these circumstances are in fact the most poor and vulnerable. They're the first people who are put out of work. Now, Mandeville's bargain essentially was as follows. To enjoy life's world's conveniences, be famed in war and yet live in ease, without great vices, is a vain utopia seated in the brain. Essentially, Mandeville believed that the bargain was private vices lead to public benefits. You could have a world of virtue, but that world would very much look like Amish country. It'd be tremendously simple. But if you wanted to enjoy all the creature comforts that the modern world could afford, you had to have vice. Vice is what kept an economy moving. It kept the wheels of commerce turning. And the people who were ultimately best off, and for Mandeville this was tremendously important, is those who were the least well off within society. The poor and the vulnerable benefited most from the vice that kept society running. Now, to a certain extent, some form of these arguments I think are familiar to a lot of us today. In fact, there doesn't seem to be anything especially revolutionary about them. But at the time, in the late 17th and early 18th century, when Mandeville was writing, these arguments were so incredibly scandalous, it's hard to overstate the matter. Why were they so scandalous? Because it seemed as if Bernard Mandeville might be onto something. That altruistic instincts didn't actually keep the gears of commerce turning. That instead, darker passions were what got us out of bed, got us to work hard, and got us to afford a society that we all ultimately enjoy. It was too easy to simply just dismiss Bernard Mandeville. You had to take him seriously. And philosopher after philosopher in the early part of the 18th century stood up to take on Bernard Mandeville, but none of them successfully. Not until this individual, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith and Bernard Mandeville only overlapped by about 11 years. Smith was born in 1723, and today he is most famous to us for his second book, The Wealth of Nations, first published in 1776. Before he published The Wealth of Nations, the kind of foundational text of modern economics, however, he found himself engaged in ethical theory. Specifically putting together the work that would be known as the Theory of Moral Sentiments, published about 17 years before The Wealth of Nations in 1759. The important thing is that Adam Smith was actually working on both books at the same time. And so as an ethicist, as someone working on moral theory, and knowing that he was going to eventually write a book in which the pursuit of self-interest would be essential to the system he was describing, what Adam Smith did not want to do is simply give a science to the vision that you find in Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. He simply did not want to provide a series of kind of algorithmic descriptions which would prove Bernard Mandeville right. Instead, he wanted to create a distinction between his vision of how an economy worked, one which is predicated on self-interest, and the bargain that Bernard Mandeville put together, which is that private vices lead to public benefits. Well, how did he do that? The main set of arguments he made in the theory of moral sentiments take up the nature of self-interest. In certain respects, because he believed that Bernard Mandeville was trying to kind of pull a fast one on us in the way in which he described vice and the degree to which he kind of created an equivalence between all vice and all self-interest. And there are a couple of different ways in which he did this. The first is Smith spent a great deal of time thinking about the different types of desires that move us. Some of these desires are laudable in nature, and some perhaps are less laudable. Let me give you an illustration. So we've all stood in line at an airport. Maybe we're late for our flight. Maybe we just don't like standing at the very back of the line. And at some point we see someone who comes up and checks out the line and then goes up to the security guard at the very front, has a quick conversation, and then they go straight through. And our immediate reaction when we see someone like that is that we're angry. We think their action is unfair. Our objection is not that they're pursuing their self-interest. Of course, we all have the same self-interest in a moment such as that. Our self-interest is to get to the gate as soon as possible. But the way in which that self-interest is pursued, the way in which the desire is expressed, we find objectionable. Similarly, if we all go out to dinner, let's say there are 4 of us, we order a pizza with 8 slices, we think it's probably fair that each of us is entitled to 2 slices. If one person, when the pizza arrives, pulls the pizza to him and takes 6 slices and puts it on his plate and pushes the pizza pan back out, our immediate reaction is, you're a pig, right? Our objection is not that they're pursuing their self-interest. Of course, their interest is to eat as much pizza as possible. It's the way in which they express their self-interest that is objectionable. Now, conversely, there are plenty of times when we pursue our self-interest that we think the action itself is entirely laudable. Let me give you 2 examples. The first thing, for those of you here who have pursued your MBA at Booth, when you told people that you had been accepted to business school, my hunch is their first reaction was not, well, boy, that's a really selfish activity on your part. Don't you think you're really important to be going to a wonderful business school? No, that's a ridiculous reaction. Most people said that's wonderful that you're going to improve and enrich yourself. Now, there's a recognition that the act of deciding to go to business school is something you do primarily for yourself. It's not necessarily altruistic in nature, which is not to say that going to a business school can't end up helping other people, but it's the kind of thing that you do to enrich and improve yourself. It's your own self-interest. But it's the type of self-interest that we tend to think is laudable, that we tend to applaud, that we tend to encourage other people to do. Let me give you a second example. If you went and told someone that you wanted to lose 15 pounds because your doctor said it was going to improve your health, if the reaction of your good friend was, boy, well, that's a really selfish thing for you to do, just to go about losing weight to make yourself feel better, you probably would end that friendship pretty quickly. Similar to deciding to go to business school to enrich yourself, deciding to lose weight to improve yourself is the kind of self-interested action that we tend to applaud. It's a desire that we have individually, which we think, once again, is laudable by nature and that we encourage in other people. But it's also essentially a self-interested action. It is no doubt true that when you're a healthier person, there are benefits that accrue to other people around you, but the greatest beneficiary of improving your own health is you yourself. But as Smith would suggest, the idea that that type of self-interested action is in any way morally problematic is just nonsense. There are plenty of desires that we have that we not only laud, but that we suggest in other people that they should cultivate. We actually encourage people to indulge in particular types of self-interest like education, getting healthy, often to the exclusion of other types of interests. And for Smith, that was the only argument he had to make vis-a-vis Mandeville, that not all self-interested pursuits were essentially the same. Now, if you wanted to ultimately construct an economic system in which the pursuit of self-interest was central to how that economy worked, material goods had to come into the picture. You couldn't simply just describe desires and motivations goods had to play a central role as well. And in the same way in which Adam Smith describes different types of passions, desires, motivations, he also wants to connect them to different types of goods that we desire or pursue. The example that Adam Smith gives is the clean shirt. If someone comes to you and says, I have a desire for a clean shirt, that is typically a desire we approve of, especially if you've ever sat next to someone with a not so clean shirt for an extended period of time. I trust no one in the room is actually like that right now. But if you have sat next to someone who does not have a clean shirt, the desire to have a clean shirt doesn't seem morally problematic. In fact, if anything, I would encourage in most of my friends that they wear clean shirts, or perhaps that they buy new shirts when they get holes in them. The desire for that particular type of good is not morally problematic whatsoever. And at the far end, if someone had a desire, say for example, for a shirt spun of gold with ruby crystals at a price of say $250,000, and look online, there are individuals like this, our reaction might not be to applaud them. We might not want to say that such expenses should be illegal, but they're certainly not the types of things we would encourage in ourselves or in our children. All Smith has to point out here is that there are plenty of times in which we have interests that take shape around certain kinds of goods and pursuits therein that we applaud, and others that we're a little bit more morally suspect of. And actually, this gives you a chance to have what amounts to a compelling moral discussion. A lot of our debates take shape around different feelings about particular self-interested motives and how they play out with particular goods. All Smith has to prove is that not all self-interested actions are created equal. And there are plenty of actions, including, say, for example, founding your own business, trying to put together a compelling enterprise that ought to be applauded. The final argument he makes connects to an insight that comes actually from The Wealth of Nations. And that is that when you have a commercial world predicated on the division of labor, it's a world in which we are all dependent on one another. Think of all the good things that you enjoy in your lives. If you had to provide them for yourself, even given an infinite amount of time and all the tools at your disposal, there's no way you could do that. As humans, we are constantly depending on one another, not just to work together, but to provide for goods. And our world is characterized by interdependence. And to the degree that is true, if you take the farthest extreme of Mandeville, right, a world in which we are all activated by the grossest forms of vice, it doesn't seem like a world in which any opportunity for cooperation is available. It would seem more like a world where we're spending all of this time fighting, trying to get the better of each other in ways that are kind of nasty and ugly, as opposed to providing opportunities to work together. If any of you have ever been in a work environment where no one can cooperate, it does not seem like a particularly productive work environment. And so what Smith suggests, as we're pursuing our self-interest, we have to do so in a fashion that seems essentially cooperative in nature. And the spirit of cooperation is something that Smith emphasizes throughout all of his work. Because when we pursue our self-interest, that pursuit is inevitably going to go through other people. And we can't demand of them what we want. We have to find ways to work together. So this vision of self-interest and how it plays out commercially gives rise to a vision of what business is ultimately all about that is entirely different from everything that comes before Smith. To a certain extent, Bernard Mandeville's work embraces the notion that being committed to doing business is itself a kind of negative activity. And the revolution of Adam Smith, morally speaking, is to say, actually, no, it is the case that there are plenty of professions that are engaged in business, that are primarily self-interested, that are in fact laudable. And what it means to be a successful businessman in this world involves a great deal of cooperation and attendant virtues. As Smith describes in his work, in the middling and inferior stations of life, the road to virtue and that to fortune are happily, in most cases, very nearly the same. Real and solid professional abilities joined to prudent, just, firm, and temperate conduct can very seldom fail of success. These virtues, today we would call the bourgeois virtues, prudence, justice, firmness, temperance, integrity, for someone like Adam Smith is absolutely essential to the identity of a business person, as opposed to cruelty, wickedness, arrogance, pride, vanity, envy, and greed. That's an older vision. Smith's vision is very different. And it's a vision that a lot of celebrated businessmen throughout the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century begin to embrace. Here's one example. Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was actually a friend of Adam Smith's. He was a little bit older than Smith and lived a little bit beyond him. Franklin enjoyed a nice long life. But what we forget is that he got his start as a printer apprentice and then was actually so successful in his printing business that he retired at 42, halfway through his life, because he essentially had made so much money he could devote himself to other types of passions like public service, philanthropy, and his writings. If you've read Ben Franklin's autobiography, it's a book that I feature in my classes. I highly recommend it. It reads in many respects like the first American How to Succeed in Business book. Franklin presents it as a kind of template that young people in early America could read to find out how they too could become successful. In about the first third of his book, as he's getting his start, he describes these 13 virtues he attempted to live by as a young printer, opening up his first shop. And those virtues include things like frugality, industry, and moderation. They don't include greed. They don't even actually include ambition. The virtues that Adam Smith and Ben Franklin embrace ultimately lend toward a kind of cooperative environment where we're pursuing our self-interests in such a way that we can all ultimately work together. Now, Franklin was tremendously financially successful, but don't get the feeling that you couldn't actually stage up this particular vision to encompass the wealthiest and most successful people on the planet. Take, for example, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, for a time, was the richest individual on earth. But the steel titan, at the height of his fame in 1889, took out time to write a short essay that is now known as the Gospel of Wealth. The Gospel of Wealth, in many respects, is like a manifesto for rich men, to be perfectly honest. It attempted to raise a certain kind of class consciousness among those who had been entirely successful to embrace a particular kind of image that is worthy of emulation and would put forward the very best that business has to offer. So in the book, he talks about the duty of the man of wealth. And Carnegie describes it as follows. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display or extravagance, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer and strictly bound as a matter of duty to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. Essentially, what Andrew Carnegie is suggesting to the very wealthy individuals, and he was tremendously influential. John D. Rockefeller looked on him with a great deal of admiration and mirrored his own philanthropic giving after what Carnegie had ultimately done, is that an individual pursues his self-interest in this kind of cooperative fashion. He attains success, always making himself a kind of model or paragon of virtue, and then ultimately uses his success in a case such as this to improve the community around him. It's an example, I would suggest, and certainly it's the way Adam Smith saw it, of enlightened self-interest. Now, it's important to note that it wasn't just industrialists who were trying to kind of describe their own work. They certainly had their own interests in presenting what they did in a virtuous fashion. At the same time, distinguished economists, as they were wrestling with what the economic man was, what kind of passions influenced him, also embraced this vision as well. Alfred Marshall, who in many respects is the most important economist of the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, in an inaugural lecture within a few years of Andrew Carnegie's essay, described what he understood the economic man to be in terms of his interests. Marshall said, "Whenever we get a glimpse of the economic man, he is not selfish. On the contrary, he is generally hard at work, saving capital chiefly for the benefit of others. If we analyze all the infinite variety of motives under the term love of money, we see that they include many of the highest, the most refined, and the most unselfish elements of our nature." Now, even if you don't buy that the economic man is always without selfishness, the important thing to emphasize is a kind of mixture of motives that are at stake here. Some of them better, some of them may be somewhat worse. But certainly not all of them can be classified as vice per se, nor does, say, a guiding star like greed seem to cover all of them at one time. There is this vision that those people who are engaged consistently in business are worthy of emulation for their very behavior. Well, what changes? The first thing that changes is actually propitious for this vision. That is, the very nature of capitalism takes a different shape over the course of the 19th century and the early 20th century than the vision of Adam Smith, which is very much a kind of old world vision where the types of figures that he celebrates are typically the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, small, independent shopkeepers. That's what it meant to be largely engaged in business. You did some kind of work for yourself, you were dependent on yourself within this larger, more complex community. Now, it is true that very few people come out of Booth today longing to be butchers, bakers, or brewers. Our world has changed in many respects. But it's also true that most people who come out of a place like a business school are also not going to work immediately or primarily for themselves, but are going to work within a larger, more complex corporate organism. That's what the face of business looked like. The Harvard business historian Alfred Chandler described this change at this particular time as follows. He said a businessman of today, writing in the 70s, would find himself at home in the business world of 1910. But the business world of 1840 would be a strange, archaic, and arcane place. So too the American businessman of 1840 would find the environment of 15th century Italy more familiar than that of his own nation 70 years later. The very nature of business had evolved, right? And in one way of kind of understanding that is if you think, say, for example, of the degree that many of you in this room have, an MBA, it's a master's in business administration. You have been trained, at least in the original idea of business schools, many of which are founded in the early part of the 20th century, to be super duper middle managers, to be right within this classic organizational chart that you see here from GM. This was the vision of what business was like, and it was something that was eagerly embraced in the first half of the 20th century. The famous journalist and founder of the New Republic, Walter Lippmann, reflecting on these developments right around the First World War, described it as follows. He said, "In big business, the real government is passing into a hierarchy of managers and deputies who, by what would look like a miracle to Adam Smith, are able to cooperate pretty well toward a common end." Now, I would take issue in just one part of that quote with Mr. Lippmann, which is I think Adam Smith himself very much appreciated the central part of cooperation in capitalism. But if cooperation were important to the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, for those working within a larger, more complex corporate organism, it was absolutely essential. And so in many respects, the very trends that Adam Smith describes, that people like Ben Franklin and Andrew Carnegie celebrate, and someone like an Alfred Marshall continues to kind of elaborate on, are in fact supported by these very developments. Something, however, changes. Our friend here, Gordon Gekko, who we're going to return to here in a second. After the Second World War, there's a bit of a sea change in capitalism, a rise of a spirit that I'm going to call renegade capitalism. Now, I can't talk about all of the different factors that went into this change, but I want to single out a couple of them. The first is with reference to this gentleman right here, Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter originally wrote his most famous work right around the Second World War, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, revised it a little bit, and then died in 1950. That work is most familiar to us today for the idea of creative destruction. If you have this older Smithian vision of capitalism where cooperation is absolutely essential, you have a vision of an economy almost like an organism that slowly kind of develops over time, right? Slow and steady makes the grade, so to speak. Schumpeter thought this was actually a fundamental misunderstanding of how capitalism works. Cooperation is not what is essential ultimately to commercial growth and development. Instead, it's a sensibility of creative destruction, which he described as follows. Any existing structures and all the conditions of doing business are always in a process of change. Every situation is being upset before it has had time to work itself out. This process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. So as opposed to, in many respects, the kind of lulling vision of bureaucracy and managed capitalism, which had kind of caught the consciousness of people before the Second World War, what Schumpeter offered is a very different vision, one in which creative destruction, the type of momentous disruptive moments that see us leave behind what has once been done and to move in an entirely different direction, are absolutely essential. Well, how does creative destruction come about? you need agents of creative destruction. In Schumpeter's work, they're actually the entrepreneur. But not the entrepreneur in, say, the conventional sense of someone acting independently on his own. Instead, it's a kind of spirit. The individual who, regardless of where he or she is at a particular given time, is willing to shake things up, is willing to say no, is willing to stand up and often shake her fist and say, I don't care how everyone else is doing it. I don't care if this is the way in which everyone else wants to do it. We must do it this way. This way is better. Now, of course, for most of us having worked with individuals like that, they're deeply frustrating. People who don't want to cooperate are not especially pleasant to work with. And frankly, Schumpeter was quite honest about this. The way he described the agent of creative destruction was as follows: to act with confidence beyond the range of familiar beacons, and to overcome that resistance requires aptitudes that are present in only a small fraction of the population, and that define the entrepreneurial type as well as the entrepreneurial function. This idea that there is resistance shouldn't be surprising to us. When someone stands up and says, I don't care if everyone else in this room thinks we should do it this way, I'm going to stamp my foot until we do it a different way. That is the agent of creative destruction. And just think about the very concept, the way it's titled itself. We often focus on the creative side, what someone is putting together. But it is destruction that precedes it. You destroy what's there to clear the way for something new. And an individual like that has to be highly individual, has to have a strong sense of individuality, has a willingness to kind of make waves, be unfriendly, often in fact be hostile. Now, for Schumpeter as well, it also took a particularly rare and distinctive person. He said supernormal intelligence and energy account for industrial success, and in particular for the founding of industrial positions in 9 cases out of 10. So as opposed to this kind of older vision of the way in which capitalism would work, in which we all play an essential role in seeing capitalism progress, this was a very different vision. Deeply elitist, tremendously hierarchical in some respects, a focus on unique individuals who would stand out, who would shake things up, and who were capable of doing extraordinary things. These were very few in nature, and it raised kind of a broader question: if they were absolutely so essential to how capitalism ultimately worked, how do you motivate individuals like that? And how do you understand the reward they ultimately get? Oftentimes, the way in which we describe a function like greed is someone taking something that is not really due him or her. But if you're talking about a system that is absolutely dependent on a small group of people, and their work, but for their work we would not ultimately move ahead, their work is essential to keeping capitalism moving. If those people, the Steve Jobs types, say for example, are essential to the way capitalism works, should we begrudge them incredible desserts that come to them? Are their activities consistent with greed, or simply the just desserts they're due? This becomes a live question, I would suggest, throughout the 50s and the 60s. And in many respects, this woman right here, Ayn Rand, comes forward as, to a certain degree, I would say, the poor man's Joseph Schumpeter. She never acknowledges Schumpeter's work, but I think there's a kind of deep influence in the way in which she looks at the world and how ultimately an economy works. This particular passage I've put up here comes from Atlas Shrugged, the particular passage toward the very end of the book that's most famous for the long, extensive monologue of John Galt. She would later actually re-quote this passage, something typically you don't do when you're citing yourself within a paper. I do not encourage my students to cite themselves in their own papers, but you can get away with it if you're Ayn Rand. This passage would return again in a famous essay called What is Capitalism? And what it attempted to describe is her vision of the way in which a capitalist economy worked and the just desserts that went to that small group of people. For her, not the entrepreneur, she would use the term creator, those special individuals for whom without our economy would not proceed. Rand says, in proportion to the mental energy he spent, the man who creates a new invention receives but a small percentage of his value in terms of material payment, no matter what fortune he makes, no matter what millions he earns. But the man who works as a janitor in the factory producing that invention receives an enormous payment in proportion to the mental effort that his job requires of him. And the same is true of all men in between, on all levels of ambition. The man at the top of the intellectual pyramid contributes the most to all those below him, but gets nothing except his material payment, receiving no intellectual bonus from others to add to the value of his time. The man at the bottom, who left to himself would starve in his hopeless ineptitude, contributes nothing to those above him, but receives the bonus of all their brains. Now, this is something of an extreme statement. Ayn Rand favored extreme statements. But it certainly does cut to the heart of the matter with respect to creative destruction and this very different vision of capitalism. As opposed to the cooperative and in many respects deeply egalitarian vision of capitalism, which we see in Adam Smith and throughout the 18th, 19th, and early part of the 20th century, this is a deeply elitist vision. One in which there are certain individuals who are generally fractive, uncooperative, the type of people who kind of stand up and won't take no for an answer, not essentially the kind of people you perhaps want to work with. These super extraordinary individuals who are not especially pleasant, you probably wouldn't want to have them as a father or a best friend. These individuals are the types of folks who make capitalism ultimately work. And they're small in nature, there are very few of them. And if they exceed beyond all proportions, how can we begrudge them the spoils that they get from their work? The hallmarks, I would suggest, of renegade capitalism, a vision that takes shape in the 50s and 60s, and I think comes to full fruition in some respects in the 70s and 80s, are as follows. The first is a commitment to kind of a hyper-individualism, not simply being independent in nature, but always keeping others to a certain degree at arm's length to preserve your own view of the world. Together with that, unsurprisingly, is a deep distrust of bureaucracy, whereas bureaucracy is something that is celebrated in the first half of the 20th century as the very best that capitalism in its development has to offer. In the second half of the 20th century, the growth of bureaucracy is seen as something that, if anything, puts a brake on the development of capitalism, which ultimately means you need those with a deeply confrontational spirit to shake things up, to lend themselves to that destruction so that new creation can take place. And hand in hand with that confrontational spirit is an increasing emphasis on what we might call selfishness or greed. Ayn Rand herself writes a book described as the virtue of selfishness. There's a far more permissive attitude toward the types of activities that once were seen as morally compromising, because there's a tendency to view them now as somehow essential to making sure capitalism ultimately works. And what that leads to, I would say in the extreme, is a kind of moral warrant for bad behavior. We often see this, I would say, today, for example, in Silicon Valley, when people talk about the need to fight against regulations and bureaucracy, to even go outside of the law, because but for doing that, the change that is absolutely necessary cannot happen. I think in many respects, all of these hallmarks come together in the figure of Gordon Gekko. In 1987, Oliver Stone releases the movie Wall Street, and this figure of Gordon Gekko is given over to popular culture. We're going to take a look at here the famous greed is good speech, but let me set it up for you a little bit before we do. In this part of the movie, Gordon Gekko is trying to launch a hostile takeover of Teldar Paper, a small to mid-sized company. And you'll see him here at a shareholders meeting getting a chance to speak, and he gives essentially a kind of war cry on behalf of a particular vision of capitalism that I've represented as renegade capitalism. And in so doing, a kind of vindication of the spirit of greed. So let's look at that clip now.
Your company, ladies and gentlemen, is under siege from Gordon Gekko. Teldar Paper is now leveraged to the hilt like some piss-poor South American country. I strongly recommend you to see through Mr. Gekko's shameless intention here to strip this company and severely penalize the stockholders. I strongly recommend you to reject his tender by voting for management's restructuring of the stock. I think.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity you're giving me, Mr. Cromwell, as the single largest shareholder in Teldar Paper, to speak. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're not here to indulge in fantasy, but in political and economic reality. America has become a second-rate power. Its trade deficit and its fiscal deficit are at nightmare proportions. Now, in the days of the free market, when our country was a top industrial power, there was accountability to the stockholder. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the men that built this great industrial empire made sure of it because it was their money at stake. Today, management has no stake in the company. Altogether, these men sitting up here own less than 3% of the company. And where does Mr. Cromwell put his $1 million salary? Not in Teldar stock. He owns less than 1%. You own the company. That's right. You, the stockholder, and you are all being royally screwed over by these bureaucrats with their steak lunches, their hunting and fishing trips, their corporate jets and golden parachutes.
This is an outrage. You're out of line, Gekko.
Teldar paper, Mr. Cromwell, Teldar paper has 33 different vice presidents, each earning over $200,000 a year. Now, I have spent the last 2 months analyzing what all these guys do, and I still can't figure it out. One thing I do know is that our paper company lost $110 million last year, and I'll bet that half of that was spent in all the paperwork going back and forth between all these vice presidents. The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
So I have not yet had the opportunity to be played off the stage to Frank Sinatra, but I'm looking forward to that opportunity at some point in one of my classes. Greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Now, it's important to note that those aren't all exactly the same things, right? Each of them probably should be assessed unto itself. And in the fall issue of the Chicago Booth Review, I take up the kind of longer-term legacy of the particular figure of Gordon Gekko and what it says about contemporary capitalism. And I would encourage you all to take a look at that essay when you have a chance. But what, for purposes of this talk, I think, at the very end of this short history of greed I've tried to provide, is the way in which Gekko, with his unapologetic embrace of greed and his embodiment of a particular kind of spirit of capitalism, I'm calling renegade capitalism, raises, I think, certain questions that are worth keeping in mind for all of us. Where does this ultimately leave us? The first question I would propose is the difference between the pickpocket and Larry Page. If the only moral difference between the pickpocket and Larry Page is ultimately that when the pickpocket takes your money, it's illegal, and when Larry Page establishes something like Google, a corporation that sees you ultimately paying him, and that's a legal activity, it's not a moral distinction at all. How do we understand those activities at the farthest extremes of selfishness? And do we want to make any distinctions whatsoever? When you say greed is good, you've given up all of those distinctions. And of course, it shouldn't be surprising, cinematically speaking, that at the very end of Wall Street, someone like Gordon Gekko is hauled off in handcuffs for breaking insider trading rules. How do we actually rehabilitate, and do we need to, these distinctions between different types of pursuits of self-interest? Because to be sure, when the pickpocket takes your wallet or when Larry Page collects his check, either of them are activated by a certain kind of notion of the pursuit of monetary self-interest. Second concern worth keeping in mind, incommensurate goods. The toughest part about Mandeville's bargain is that it is always a trade-off between incommensurate goods. You can trade away all of this virtue, and you get all of these material goods in turn. Or you can trade back those material goods, and you can get virtue. Those are ultimately incommensurate goods. One isn't exactly reducible to the other. So how do we think about the relationship between these different types of goods on the one hand, and on the other, if we live in a society that's, say, a subsistence or a developing society, we are probably willing to trade away a lot of good behavior for more bread, a blanket, and a roof. But to the degree we live in a modern, well-developed society, there may actually come a point where we say, actually, I don't need more material goods. I don't need the very best things that greed brings about. What I really need is more good behavior or other things that come with it. So how do we think about the balance between incommensurate goods? The third question is the secondary effects of selfishness. If you have ever been in a community or a corporate environment where everyone is just exceedingly selfish, no matter how financially successful and dynamic that group ultimately is, we all know that it's miserable to work in an environment like that. Financially speaking, as a monetary matter, there may be tremendous success, but there are secondary effects to that selfishness which make our lives miserable. So how do we ultimately think about those secondary effects, especially when we embrace as an extreme the ethic, the unapologetic ethic, that greed is good? And finally, the structural integrity of capitalism. Go back to Adam Smith. He was most doubtful with respect to Bernard Mandeville that the type of society he was describing would ever ultimately represent stability, would be the kind of society one would ultimately want to live in. We live in a world today where I would suggest the status of capitalism is in greater doubt than it has been certainly in recent decades. The amount of public faith people have in capitalism has been shaken for many different reasons. To the degree that we talk about greed, can be glib about saying greed is good, do we actually imperil the very structural integrity of capitalism? Do we actually worry, and should we worry, about killing off the golden goose by being so casual about the way in which we think about greed? Sometimes I think we take the structural integrity of capitalism for granted. I don't think there's any good reason, and I don't think history gives us any good reason to do so. So I conclude by the question not, is greed good? I actually think there's a better question, and one worth bearing in mind. How good is it? Thank you all very much. So I've had a chance to talk a long time, thank you, and I now want to take some questions from the audience. Yes? So there is this interesting question. How do you think about comparing a world that, from our perspective, if you're thinking of Adam Smith, it looks like the developing world, to our deeply affluent world? And what role does that play in this broader discussion? On the one hand, as I've suggested already a bit, if you're thinking about a world of subsistence, and you're truly worried about dying of starvation or exposure, you are probably willing to trade off a lot of bad behavior to make sure your belly is filled and you have a roof over your head at night. We, of course, don't live in that world any longer. We live in a world of tremendous safety and security, at least in our developed world. And I would suggest to some extent the degree to which we are more anxious about greed today than before may be a reflection of that. At some point when you live in a world of abundance, you do not need more and better Cheetos. More and better Cheetos, more material goods will not solve any of your problems. This is not to say that the material goods we get from development aren't wonderful, but they don't fundamentally change our lives. And they may not actually address the very problems that most shape society. And I think that that's actually something that we struggle with in the developed world. Let me give you an example from a figure who didn't make an appearance in this presentation, John Maynard Keynes. Writing in the 30s, John Maynard Keynes essentially thought that capitalism would reach a point at development where we'd essentially provided for most of the material goods we needed. There always could be further improvements to be made, but for the most part, safety and security, health, and simple hunger would all be addressed. And he suggested at that point, you actually might see a shift a greater distrust of greed and the bad behavior that might go along with it, and a willingness to actually restrain the invisible hand to get other goods. More capitalism might address certain kinds of concerns. I wouldn't suggest it addresses all types of concerns. When you have an empty belly, you might be willing to take as much capitalism as you can get. An empty belly is not something we worry about, at least in the developed world. We have other types of worries. And the question is, would more capitalism, would more greed address those concerns? One of the reasons that greed took off in the way it did in some respects is because it did provide, the pursuit of self-interest provided a lot of wonderful things. But at some point, are those really the things we're looking for? Does more greed, does greater capitalism answer the questions that we have? When it doesn't, one of the things we might think about restraining is, in fact, whether it be the pursuit of self-interest or greedy tendencies. And I would suggest that's probably somewhat of the world that we occupy here today, and it's certainly a very different world from Adam Smith's. Other questions that people have that I can address or answer. Do we really think that greed is ultimately good? I would suggest that we are not as unapologetic about greed, certainly as Gordon Gekko is. That's what makes Gordon Gekko interesting, right? He speaks in black and white terms. He isn't willing to get into a lot of the minutiae and the details and the ambiguities we've been spending a lot of time on here over the last hour. I think for most of us, we are reticent to say greed is good. We're also reticent to say greed is bad. And I think that's one way in which we're very different, say, for example, from the types of figures who we began this talk with. In part because we recognize that a particular kind of self-interested instinct, whether we want to say it's self-interest or selfishness, actually redounds to everyone else's benefit. We do appreciate that there are benefits that come from greed, which certainly a St. Thomas Aquinas or a Martin Luther were unwilling to acknowledge. The question becomes, is it all self-interested behavior? Again, this distinction between Larry Page and the pickpocket, right? The pickpocket is acting on his self-interest when he takes your wallet. Is there any real good that comes from that? Is any kind of self-interested practice ultimately one that redounds to our benefit? I suggest that to the degree that we don't unapologetically say that greed is good, it's because we realize figures like the pickpocket and perhaps others still hover out there in some way. And in part because we ultimately think that the greatest vindication of self-interest and even greed is the common good. So if we take up the example, say, of philanthropy, it is one thing for an individual to pursue his self-interest for a long period of time, and we are willing to applaud that today in a way that we wouldn't have done 300 or 400 years ago. But as long as, for the most part, the benefits that come from his activity or her activity ultimately redound to the common good. And that's why when we discuss someone like, say, for example, a Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, we look at them very differently than those billionaires who often don't necessarily come to our attention, who spend all of their money on yachts and paintings, right? Why do we make that distinction? I think in part because a commitment to the common good, direct or indirect, and greed is all about a kind of indirect commitment to the common good, is something that vindicates that activity in the first place. Not everyone feels that way. Someone like, say, for example, an Ayn Rand would not be entirely comfortable with the very distinctions we're describing. But it is the case when we talk about self-interest, when we talk about selfishness, and certainly when we talk about greed, we feel that it is easiest to defend, morally speaking, when the benefits redound to the rest of us. We're happy for someone's success. That's all well and good. But it seems something especially laudable when those activities end up improving the rest of us. Other questions that people have that I can address? Yes. Yeah, is ultimately Gordon Gekko a hero or a villain? I think in many respects he's somewhat of an anti-hero. It is absolutely true that when Oliver Stone was putting together Wall Street, Gekko was supposed to be this villainous figure. And yet he's absolutely the person that we return to. He makes the movie. Now, he's not someone that Oliver Stone wanted us to embrace in the same way that Bret Easton Ellis didn't want the central figure, Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, to be a person that we embraced. In the same way that Michael Lewis, when he wrote Liar's Poker, presented his own story as a cautionary tale as opposed to something that should be embraced. Why in each of these cases do we embrace these figures who are presented as, to some extent, either cautionary tales or villainous in nature? I mean, to a certain extent, it's titillating to embrace villains. But I also think it connects to this idea that there is some ambivalence we have about greed. In the medieval world, greed was bad, period, end statement. Today, most of us, I would suggest, are not comfortable with that. We think that there should be some more nuance, in part because we get caught up on this notion that actually self-interested pursuits do end up benefiting a lot of people. Do they benefit people in all ways or only material ways? What does the kind of spirit of self-interest at the extreme mean? We begin to get confused. We have a kind of ambivalence ourselves. And to the degree that greed and certainly kind of self-interested pursuits can be addictive in their own ways, and who doesn't want to feel successful or feel as though he or she has vindicated his or her own ambition, someone like a Gordon Gekko is kind of wonderful to indulge. But do we embrace that person entirely? No. We feel that same amount of ambivalence. What I'm interested in is how much ambivalence do we feel? Are we only a little bit ambivalent about greed? If we're only a little bit ambivalent about greed, we are willing to give sanction to a much wider array of motives and activities than Adam Smith ever dreamed. And if we're deeply ambivalent about greed, we probably are going to narrow the range of activities that we find laudable. I think between those 2 points, we find our contemporary struggle, and I think that pendulum can swing back and forth. I think we are probably a little bit more distrusting of greed than we were 30 years ago or 20 years ago because of the financial crisis and other experiences. But certainly, I think very few people today are comfortable with saying, without any apology, that greed is bad or that greed is good. We lie somewhere in between. Any other questions? We'll maybe take 2 more if there are any. So how do we think about the relationship between labor on the one hand and greed on the other? My mother warned me when I started working that no matter what work I ever did, it would be nothing like the backbreaking work my grandfather did as a farmer. It would never be that difficult, she warned me. And frankly, although I haven't had experience as a farmer, I imagine she's absolutely right. My work is tremendously easy in terms of the physical demands of my work relative to that of the farmer or most kinds of manual labors. It is true that when you go back to, say, the world of Adam Smith and you are thinking about the connection between personal success and labor, typically the price of personal success, although not always, was something akin to backbreaking labor, the kind of labor that didn't just take up all of your time, but tended to affect your body. And to the degree your labor looks difficult and people can quantify how hard you've worked, the just desserts that seem to come from your activities are vindicated. To the degree your work looks closer to, say, for example, winning the lottery, right? If I buy a scratch ticket and I scratch it off and I win $1 million, we might say legally I have a right to that $1 million, but it's weird to say I earned it, right? If you win the Powerball, you may win hundreds of millions of dollars. You may have a right to that money, but it's strange to say that you earned it. And we're a little bit reticent to talk in terms of fairness with respect to what you get. I think there is certainly a sense in which the easier it is to kind of quantify the work you do or the success you've had, the easier it is to defend what you get from that, right? Which makes someone who's like the manual labor, or I'd say, for example, the successful singer. When the successful singer goes out on stage in Madison Square Garden, there's a sense in which you can look at the tens of thousands of people who've been entertained by her song, and it seems harder in some way to kind of begrudge her whatever comes from that. The more the work looks closer to the scratch ticket, something that you do without expending a lot of kind of physical pain or angst, something that seems to come a little bit too easy, something that doesn't seem to have a really high cost, the less likely we are to feel that the allocation is fair. Now, whether or not it should be illegal per se, that's a slightly different matter. But the more that we can create that connection between hard work and just desserts, the easier it is for us to defend what people ultimately get. And so I think that helps to describe some of the distinctions that maybe bedevil us in this modern world, where some of the most successful people are not necessarily those who are creating companies that we can see right in front of us, but who are very good at manipulating and managing data and information. That certainly doesn't look like the backbreaking labor my grandfather did. It also doesn't look like the work that I do as well. And maybe it makes it harder for the average person to see the desserts that come to that person as being somehow just. Now, whether they should be legal or not is an entirely different matter. It's a question of how ultimately we feel. And it's harder for us to feel that something is fair if we can't understand the direct cause and effect. Let me take one more question, if there is. Yes, in the back there. So how do we think about the relationship between the tendency of creative destruction and the different types of goods that we might hope will come from creative destruction? This, I would say, is a very difficult question, in part because if you are in an environment characterized, whether by managerial capitalism or creative destruction, it's not just a question of what you're doing, it's also a question of what everyone else is doing around you. And that may actually limit the choices you effectively have. Sometimes you have to take choices that you'd rather not make because you realize if you don't do it, someone else is going to eat your lunch. These are difficult decisions. And obviously, in each individual case, you're going to have to think through the different variables that are at stake. What I would suggest you're best off doing, however, is paying attention to those trade-offs and being very honest about them. I think the most dangerous thing to do is to suggest there just aren't trade-offs whatsoever, right? Or there aren't kind of different matters that are ultimately at stake, but to think through those trade-offs, how they're going to affect the decisions you'll make, and ultimately be honest with people about them, recognizing that any decision you make is going to be within a kind of complex, competitive environment. These decisions are quite difficult. I think the desire sometimes is to overly simplify them. And let's be clear, when you say greed is good, you couldn't be more simplistic. You're as simplistic as saying greed is absolutely bad. To be somewhere in the middle is to meaningfully wrestle with trade-offs, to acknowledge them, to be honest about them, and to try to do best by them. Morally speaking, I tend to think you're best off finding a degree of comfort within that gray, because that means you're going to be honest about wrestling with those trade-offs, and therefore any action you'll make is not by some kind of economic necessity, right? The invisible hand is not an iron fist. You're always free to make decisions and leave. Now, your decisions may lead to your company failing, or your decisions may lead to your company being successful. But there's no sense of economic necessity being similar to the law of gravity. The economic man or woman is always free to choose and to make those decisions. And to make the best decisions possible means to confront these very decisions, to confront the trade-offs that are established for us by creative destruction. It's not enough to simply try to say, well, I'm not going to be party to creative destruction. I'm not going to let it affect me. Well, that's silliness. Of course it's going to affect you. It describes and controls and shapes perhaps the environment you're in. But that doesn't mean you absolutely have to do anything. You're always free to choose, as of course Milton Friedman said. And that choice could be consistent with a different set of goals than those that reflect greed as good. It could be closer to greed as bad. It will most likely be somewhere in the middle. And the most important thing is that you always have to keep wrestling with them. That's what moral integrity demands. Thank you all very much.